understanding.
It's a brave new world.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess you have to get used to, you have to learn that if you're going to survive, right? Yeah. Right.
Oh, that's me.
Conference structures typically still people are doing a full day in-person conference. I don't know how to.
Yeah, that's actually okay.
You know.
Sorry, but that's okay. I forgot to put makeup on anyway. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Irish American Heritage Museum. We have a few people live in the audience. We're 6 feet away, vaccinated, so we're good. And we're delighted to have Dr. Terry Golway with us. He's been a teacher, a lecturer, and a journalist and editor for 40 years or so, but who's counting? Yeah, it's only a number. And he has spoken with us before on FDR and Al Smith. He's written a number of books about the firemen, the FDNY, and politics, of course, is your bête noire, I suppose. So I've known him for years. We worked together down at Fordham University too, when he spoke for us down there many times. So we're delighted for Terry to talk to us briefly, kind of about Irish and Irish American contributions to labour. It's one of the things we're famous for, I suppose, and this is Labour History Month, so we're marking it. So we have people live on Facebook too. Just put your comments in the chat, and I'll monitor that at the end, because we're using my laptop to film. So take it away. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in Albany. I am not from Albany. I am from Staten Island, which is not Albany, right? And I now live in New Jersey. I'm sorry to tell you. Yeah. Which means, of course, that on my many trips up to Albany, I am bait for the state police with my out-of-state plates. I am the Albany editor for Politico, which is a digital news site. We have the largest bureau of any news organization in Albany. We have 6 people, 7 when I'm here. I come up, well, before COVID, I used to come up once every 3 weeks. This is my first time up back in Albany since February 26th of 2020. I remember it because there was a live event at this museum in its former location, and I usually stay at the Holiday Inn Express nearby because there are a couple of bars there too. And I remember walking by and I thought, oh, I should stop in, but I still have work to do. So I had also spent 2 hours in a conversation with the governor. So it was a memorable day for me. And here I am back. I did not have a 2-hour conversation with the governor today, but it would have been interesting. So thank you for having me. Thank all of you whom I can't see. We're going to talk about the Irish and labor. And as Elizabeth said, it's one of the issues that people associate the Irish with. And I think sometimes we Irish Americans there's a lot of our story we've forgotten, right? I certainly think that the Irish contribution to labor is one of them. We all know about the Irish in politics. We all know about the Irish in entertainment. But, who remembers George Meade anymore, right? I do. He was the head of the AFL-CIO in the 60s and 70s. And we're hopefully going to learn about a few more people who have been forgotten. And I'm not quite sure why that's so, why the Irish have arguably forgotten about the great contribution they made to the labor movement. And however, we are reminded of it these days because with an Irish Catholic in the White House for the first time in 1963, Joe Biden, this is not a political, and remember, I am a journalist, so I am even-handed. I have no opinions that I can share, but Joe Biden is the most pro-union president, arguably since FDR. I don't think anybody actually would have considered John F. Kennedy, the other Irish Catholic president, to be particularly pro-union. I don't think he was particularly interested in labor issues. As a matter of fact, after his first crisis of his presidency, after the botched Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, John F. Kennedy did something which was why he was brilliant. He started calling people, asking for their advice, including Richard Nixon, who had been, of course, the man he defeated and who had been vice president. And Richard Nixon was known for his foreign policy smarts. So he called Nixon to consult with him about what he had done wrong about the Bay of Pigs. And he said to Nixon, and this is in several Kennedy biographies, basically he said, you know, this is what the White House is all about. I mean, who really gives a damn what the minimum wage is? Well, Joe Biden does. Whether you agree with it or not is another thing, but Joe Biden certainly has that sort of muscular pro-union and an interesting attitude, Irish attitude towards capitalism, and certainly the way capitalism has developed, which sounds like a conversation that should be had in a classroom discussion, but believe me, you'll see what I mean. That's part of I think the Irish attitude towards labor, and why the Irish were so attracted to labor unions is because of things that happened to them in Ireland that reflected the capitalism and the free trade dogma of Great Britain at that time. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. The one easy place to start in terms of just introducing the topic of the Irish and Labor Day in the labor movement is to talk about Labor Day, because Labor Day actually was invented by an Irish American, an Irish New Yorker by the name of P.J. Maguire. He became an activist in what became the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, when he was 21 years old in 1873. But in 1882, he had this idea in New York, in Manhattan, why not have a parade for labor? And we'll call it Labor Day. So that was actually the first Labor Day parade in the United States, was in New York, led by not just P.J. Maguire, but led by a bunch of Irish American trade unionists and others. Right? We always have to add that. It's not like it was just a bunch of people named Maguire marching wherever they marched. Actually, I forget. Probably near Union Square. That would be my guess. And all of this is taking place in a particular context of Irish American history, which is the Gilded Age, right? The post-Civil War accumulation of great wealth by people named Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and all those people, right? And the inequality that existed in New York and elsewhere, right? After the Panic of 1873, we call them recessions nowadays. Back then they called them panics, and panic is still a good word because panic means, oh my God, I've got to sell, right? That's why they called them that. The Panic of 1873 led to this tremendous inequality in the United States that lasted for 15 years. I mean, we all know about the Great Depression, and my parents are children of the Great Depression. It was a Great Depression. Some of the previous depressions, they were pretty great. Well, they were pretty terrible, but they were pretty great as well, in that sense that they were long lasting, 1873 being one of them. And in the 1870s, we see this Irish American reaction to the inequalities in the United States. And my particular area of expertise is New York. Luckily, we are in New York, so I can't be accused of being parochial. But particularly in New York City, we see this reaction to all of those mansions going up on Fifth Avenue, you know, the Fricks and the Carnegies and all of that, then contrasted with life on the Lower East Side, that Al Smith was born into in 1873. And there was a reaction to it, not just in New York, of course. So probably the most famous Irish American labor episode of the 1870s was in northeastern Pennsylvania with the Molly Maguires, right, who were famous in film, Malcolm McCourt, and Sean Connolly. Malcolm would be very happy I mentioned him first over Sean Connolly in the film The Molly Maguires, which I think had some basis in truth. But you know, it was a very visceral reaction by these coal miners in and around northeast Pennsylvania against their bosses, against the fact that they were clearly being exploited. And you know, it was violent. You know, this wasn't just sort of people were hanged as a result of their involvement in the Molly Maguires. There's a wonderful book by a guy by the name of Dr. Kevin Kenny, who was the head of Fluxman Ireland House in New York. He wrote In Search of the Molly Maguires, which tries to explain why there was this visceral reaction to by the coal miners to their bosses and agents. And of course, the Mollies were broken up in part by informers. One of the many Irish persons, the Pinkerton Agency. Also in that time period,
Elizabeth, we've lost the audio for some reason or other.
Please unmute.
Come from? Like, where did this attitude towards the inequities of capitalism in the Gilded Age in America, where did all of that come from? I'm glad you asked. I think this sort of skepticism of this laissez-faire capitalism in the United States, where government stepped aside and let the market rule and let free trade rule, and whatever the market decided was right. That was sort of the attitude of America and Great Britain during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. I think this goes back to the famine. I think that the Irish experience during the famine of 1845 to around 1852, they experienced in the most deadliest way possible the capricious nature of what was called free trade and the capricious nature of landholding, right? They were evicted, they were allowed to starve because the market was more important than their lot. That's how they felt. I think they were justified in feeling that way. They were the United Kingdom and the US had this dogmatic belief that free trade was not to be interfered with. Government had no role in ameliorating any of the excesses of that sort of capitalism, right? Now, one of the foremost critics of that period was a guy in New York called Bishop John Hughes, Archbishop Hughes, eventually Dagger John, who would found Fordham University and did many things. He was a native of County Tyrone, and he had one of the most stinging critiques, not just of British policy during the famine, but actually of this larger issue of what do you do when people are starving? Do you simply say, well, too bad, that's life. The market must rule, or do you actively intervene on behalf of human life? Now, we know what the administrator of British relief during the famine, George Trevelyan, said. He said that the real crime or the real trouble in Ireland was not the lack of food, but the character of the people. People are poor because they deserve, right? The people who succeed are people who are made of stern stuff, and those on the bottom are there for a reason. It's social Darwinism, right? Trevelyan, I don't think that phrase existed during the famine, but that was in essence what he was saying, right? And he also said, when he agreed that finally there should be some relief projects, and there was a period in 1846 and 47 when Britain does do relief on a massive scale, but he actually says relief should be so unattractive that people wouldn't want to take advantage of it, right? He was worried about government dependence, which, is something we hear about today and which could be argued back and forth. But when you hear George Trevelyan talk about worrying about the Irish becoming dependent when they are starving to death, that's a little harsh, right? Archbishop Hughes in New York is following the famine. And of course, his flock is now increasing because, as he said, an eighth of the Irish nation washed on the shores of South Street, right? I mean, not all famine immigrants came to New York. Many, of course, went to Canada and other places, but New York was sort of one of the places. And he said, he gave this very famous sermon and also wrote on several occasions about the famine. And he said that the problem was not the absence of food, which we all know is true, right? I mean, there was food during the famine. It was not a famine, it was a hunger, right? But the problem was an ideology, he said, that placed profits and markets ahead of human needs. The political economy, he said, found the Irish people too poor to pay for the harvest of their own labor. So it has been exported, leaving them to die. That, in a nutshell, is my interpretation of the famine. It's not everybody's, but it's mine. I suspect it's yours, Elizabeth. But what's interesting is that here's this bishop in New York saying this, right? And in this one sermon he gave too, he went on to say that there's no law of God to prevent a starving man from stealing bread wherever he can find it. This prompted outrage in New York City, right? This is, I mean, the great Peter Quinn, who's a friend of mine and a friend of the museum, has on occasion, perhaps to his regret, compared Dagger John Hughes to Al Sharpton. I'm not going to go there, except to say that the visceral reaction that sometimes Al Sharpton inspires, John Hughes did too in New York, in a very different way. So I believe that this experience of hunger and eviction was part of the Irish urge to organize in the United States. I have no evidence of that. No one ever wrote that down. Yes, I starved in Ireland. I got out. I'm going to organize. I don't know anyone who's ever written that. But we've learned as historians that we need to increase our sources because many people didn't write things down, and their stories have been lost because we don't have their letters. But we can interpret what they did. And what the Irish did once they resettled and got acclimated to their new country is the first thing they did was organize, right? Whether through the church or through labor unions. And so it's not a coincidence that by the 1870s, we see things like the Molly Maguires and we see things like the Knights of Labor. And, I tell a story in one of my books about Tammany Hall, where I deal with this issue of what was the attitude, what was the lesson that the famine Irish learned once they got here? What did they say to themselves once they were able to resettle in New York or Chicago or Boston or Albany, wherever? And I know it sounds trite, but I think that the word, and it's not particularly politically correct these days to quote from Gone with the Wind, and I understand why. However, it is a very Irish movie. And if those of you who may have seen it will remember, there's a scene right before intermission where Scarlett O'Hara goes back to her Tara, her mansion, a bunch of Irish Catholics living in a mansion in the South in 1863. Maybe it happened, but we know the Gone with the Wind was fiction. But in any case, she goes back and there's no food and she's starving. And she goes and she thinks she's found a turnip and it's turned and she eats it and she retches. And she reaches up to the sky and says, if I have to cheat, steal, murder, and she goes down all those things, I will never be hungry again. And I've always felt that summed up Irish politics at the time too, that was the one thing they were not going to let happen again. And the great Bill Kennedy, another friend in the museum, and the great novelist of Albany, has written that during his time as a young man, which was some time ago, that the greatest crime was hunger. And I think that fits into the story of labor and the Irish, particularly when you see characters like this guy I mentioned before, Terence Powderly, who was not just a powerful union organizer, but he was also involved in the Land League agitation in Ireland in the 1880s. And he was involved in Clan na Gael, which was the Irish nationalist organization of the United States. They saw it all as one piece, right? And it was very, they were very systematic in their thinking. And also, you know, as time progresses during the Gilded Age, you're starting to see Irish newspapers in New York adopt this idea that, you know what, independence from Britain isn't enough. We need to resolve social inequities. One particular newspaper, the Irish World, famously sent the economist Henry George to Ireland to watch the evictions taking place. And at one point, Patrick Ford, who was the editor, the publisher of the paper, said, changing flags doesn't matter, which is something we've heard Irish Republicans say for a long time. I don't know that Patrick Ford was the first to say it, but he certainly said, if the social system, the social inequities that we have in Ireland now persist, even under Irish rule, then nothing has been achieved, right? And I think that attitude, again, plays, you know, this intertwining of social justice and Irish nationalism, which eventually leads to the great James Connolly, who, as we know, or many of us know, worked in Troy from 1903 to 1905. He was the great Irish socialist labor organizer, you know, who, you know, died after the Easter Rising. He was the last of the prisoners executed, but he also sort of symbolizes this coming together of in his case, socialism and labor with nationalism, you know, something that was not entirely popular. And we've seen other examples of Irish Republicans who get involved in labor organizations. And I should have said from the start, I'm not a labor historian. I just know a few things, and maybe some of them are wrong. I'm sure some of them will point it out. But for example, the Transit Workers Union in New York, which operates the subways, was founded in essence by IRA guys who fought on the anti-treaty side in 1922-23. Once the Irish Civil War was over, they came to the United States. They went to work in the subways, and they founded the Transit Workers Union. So that's sort of the early years of Irish organization, but I've left out one character, one very important character, because she is so fantastic that I need to talk about her at length, and that is a woman by the name of Mother Jones. She was born Mary Harris in County Cork around 1837. She insisted that she was actually born in 1830, which, as I approach the tender-year age of 66, I wonder why anyone would say they were older than they really are, but she did. But she was quite a character. Her grandfather was sort of one of those Irish tenant farmers who disrupted the peace at night when landlords were perhaps not being as nice as they could be. And he was hanged for that crime when she was 2 years old. Her father also was out at night. They eventually left during the famine when she was about 10 years old. And to come back to the famine and to come back to the silences of the famine, and again, I'm not an expert on this. Christine Connolly of Quinnipiac knows more about this than I'll ever be able to know. But it is interesting that Mary Harris is has seen these terrible things as a child. She leaves Ireland in the middle of the famine. When she goes to write her memoir, much, much later, she devotes 4 sentences to her life in Ireland. And I think it's because she just couldn't deal with it. I see no other explanation for it. But her family first settled in Toronto. They went there, she made her way to Memphis, where she married a guy by the name of George Jones, who was a union official. And while, I suppose it maybe sounds a little too patriarchal to say, but I do think that her introduction to modern labor organizing was through her husband, George Jones. She had 4 children during the Civil War in Memphis, Tennessee. So she was in a Confederate state, which again, several people have written biographies of Mother Jones, Mary Harris. Not quite sure how she wound up in a Confederate state, but there you are. After the war was over, there was a terrible outbreak of yellow fever in Memphis, and in the course of about 5 months, she lost all 4 children and her husband. And, one after another, and her husband being the last one. How she survived those tragedies is beyond me, but she goes to Chicago and she sets up a dressmaking shop, which is promptly burned to the ground during the Chicago fire of 1871. And this is a woman who has seen unspeakable tragedies. And I think that might explain what comes next. In her memoir, she never says there's this aha moment when she says, labor union, labor organizing, that should be my outlook. But she does write that in Chicago at the time, like in New York, there are these great fortunes on display. Cyrus McCormick and George Pullman and Marshall Field, names that still mean a lot in Chicago, are building these mansions and great properties. And meanwhile, she and others in Chicago are living in poverty. So she joined the Knights of Labor. So once again, to prove that the Knights of Labor was very broad-minded in taking people other than, say, skilled workmen. And she became friendly with this fellow I mentioned, Terence Powderly. And they write to each other and they begin to, this is a very intellectual exercise where they're talking about the inequities in society and what can we do about them. So her aha moment, however, comes in 1886 at the Haymarket Riot, which several policemen were killed when they were trying to break up a labor demonstration with workers demanding an 8-hour day. The Haymarket Riot has been interpreted in several ways. Some people have interpreted it as, the murder of police officers, which police officers were killed when someone threw a bomb. But I've seen more recent interpretations where maybe that story is a little bit more complicated. But nevertheless, the Haymarket Affair was this big moment in Chicago labor history. And apparently that was the moment where Mary Harris, who by then, of course, was known as Mary Jones, invents this character called Mother Jones. People just naturally started calling her Mother because by now she was middle-aged and she was now beginning to organize young men, but young women, and they just called her Mother. And so she loved that idea and started just calling herself Mother Jones. She went on to devote her life to organizing. She was part of Coxey's Army, which was a large group of unemployed people who marched on Washington after the Panic of 1893, as opposed to the Panic of 1873, which was, again, an awful time in America that people have forgotten. The Panic of 1893 led to the nomination of William Jennings Bryan as a populist presidential candidate in 1896, because he too preached about the inequities of Gilded Age capitalism, although he was more concerned with farmers, which were many of them, than he was with the city. But she especially became associated with mine workers. And I assume that that's Terence Powderly's influence. She's leading the pickets during some of these very violent strikes in Pennsylvania and out in the heartland. She adopts this attitude of being a hellraiser. She says in her correspondence, I am a hellraiser, that's who I am. And so through this agitation, and I've read several stories of Mother Jones being on the front lines of picket lines with all these coal miners, these big early coal miners. And here's this, sort of little Irish woman, leading the charge. And they loved her. The coal miners and all the workers loved her. So she became a celebrity. As a reporter, as I do fancy myself on occasion, when I'm not being introduced as doctor, I get it. I mean, if you're going to cover a strike and there's this woman from Ireland, agitating for coal miners, and then there are coal miners telling their story, but who's the story here? And she was not shy about it. And she knew how to give a good quote. So, for example, she became such a celebrity that during the Wilson years in the White House from 1912 to 1920, I think this happened around 1914, there was great industrial unrest right before World War I, leading to the bombing of the Los Angeles Times, where people were killed. And Woodrow Wilson asked Frank Walsh, who would eventually become Attorney General of Montana, he was from Montana, he was a senator at the time, to put together a special committee looking into industrial relations. And one of their first witnesses is Mother Jones. And if you look at the newspapers at the time, the press is there in force. This is a woman who understood the power of press, the power of image, the power of a well-turned phrase, right? And as she's being sworn in as a witness, Chairman Frank Walsh, who is clearly sympathetic to her too, which is interesting, says, I think they could call her Mother Jones, could you tell us where you live? And her answer was, wherever workers are fighting the robbers. I didn't attempt a County Cork accent, but imagine that in the County Cork accent, right? So she was also not well liked by lots of people, but amazingly, she was among the people who really liked her was John D. Rockefeller Jr., not the older guy, right? John D. Rockefeller Jr. And at one point, she decided in 1930, she decides she's going to celebrate her 100th birthday, even though, again, like her birth certificate says 1837. But yeah, it took a historian to find that, right? Just go, all right, if she says she's 100, who are we to disagree, right? So it's a big, there's actually, you can Google it. There's some YouTube video of Mother Jones sitting in front of her birthday cake with 100 candles, even though the show should have been 93 or whatever. And among the people, and then they start reading telegrams. This was not on the video. It's a very short piece. But they're reading telegrams to her, and they read a telegram from John D. Rockefeller Jr., congratulating her on being a 100-year-old. And she said to the reporters who were there, again, I'm not going to do the accent, but you can picture it. Yeah, he's a damn good sport. I've licked him many times, but we made our peace. Right? Which, Mother Jones and Johnny Rockefeller Jr. could make peace. Well, maybe we can in the United States today too. Right? So I think that was a period of real Irish American presence in labor. Of course, it continues. I mean, it continues today. But the person that, in my modest reading of labor history, the Irish American I associate most with the labor movement in sort of the middle of the 20th century would be George Meade, who was the head of the AFL-CIO. Among people my age, I think, and older maybe, some people remember that George Meade was kind of pro-Vietnam War, and that's tarred his image, I think, among some people. But he was a good, he was by all accounts a great labor leader who helped the merger of the AFL-CIO. Again, in that great divide of the AFL versus CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations was always much more progressive, if you will, radical, if you will, where the AFL, was sort of from the Samuel Gompers tradition of, look, this is just about wages and working conditions, right? So I think, the Irish tended to be more on the AFL side. Of course, one interesting thing worth noting is that one of the more prominent union presidents during the 1950s was Ronald Reagan, right, who was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and to this day is the only United States president to ever have led a labor union. But again, maybe people who don't know that would be more likely to remember Ronald Reagan as the most anti-union president of the United States, which, and I'm not in a position to say whether that's true or false, but I do remember when he fired all of the air traffic controllers, when the air traffic controllers went on strike. And I think certainly in his first term, I'm thinking, and this is just from memory, 1982 or 83, the air traffic controllers, like my father's union, the United Firefighters Association, were barred by law from going on strike. The air traffic controllers went on strike, and Reagan, I remember watching television, him march out to a podium like this and basically say, you're all fired. And people who've studied, union membership over the last 50 years will say that that was a big moment in the decline of labor organization and labor membership in the post-war era, because that would set a chilling effect. Again, I don't understand the issue well enough to know why that's so, I would have thought it was just episodic. Okay, he fired the air traffic controllers. How does that affect me as a, ex-member of the AFL-CIO? But it does seem clear that that was this moment where, and maybe it's just for dramatic effect, where the post-war decrease in union membership sort of became, Niagara Falls of declining membership. But today we have another Irish American president who has the very opposite idea of that. And I feel I've carried on a little bit too long, but one story that shows still, I think, the power of what it means to be a member of a union to this day. And it's a personal story. My son is a video editor who's been working for MSNBC as a freelancer for about a year and a half. He's at Marist College 2018. Did this sort of apprenticeship, I guess you would say. And just the other day, he was told he was going to be hired full-time and would be in the union. And I told the story to a bunch of friends of mine, and the reaction was instantaneous. It's like, oh, good, he's going to be in the union. And that told me something about that power. I mean, I belonged to 2 unions in my day. I'm not a union. I'm management now. So, yeah. Maybe I'm in the managers union. But to me, that visceral reaction from several people I know my age who are not unionized themselves, to nod and say, okay, that's a good thing. It's good that he's in the union, and maybe that's a sign that people are beginning to understand, what the value of union membership was and can be, and the fact that we have a pro-union president now may change the dynamic. But there's no question that the American union movement would not have been the same without the Irish. I know it sounds like one of those Irish things that you say, but it's true, right? The Irish were at the vanguard and forefront of the movement at its critical time, at its birth. It presided over its maturity. Some people would say Ronald Reagan, helped bring about its downfall, and maybe today an Irish American president will be divided. So that's my spiel. I'm eager to take questions because maybe you'll tell me something I don't know, which would not be hard to do. Yes.
Maybe for Irish Americans, since separation from the family to the present, nationalism versus class,
Right.
which labor, which way more?
Could you repeat the question? We can't hear it on the other side of a Zoom project. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was wondering about that. Yeah, well, these 2 strains in Irish America since the famine of nationalism versus sort of class struggle, if you will, right? That's fair assessment. I mean, it is a very good question. I mean, I think that my guess is that nationalism wins that contest. But there are also examples of people who tried to marry those 2. They tended to be the exception. But when we were just in our own lifetimes of watching what happened in Northern Ireland, we never really saw an analysis of that. Well, we did, but I mean, the more common analysis was Brits out, right? Just Brits out. Not, well, what can we do for the shipbuilding industry, which is leaving Northern Ireland, and how's that? So I think nationalism always wins out that on that contest. It's a very good question. And I because I'm a journalist, I don't belong to any organizations. But I know that when I talk to people and talk to organizations, I'm very rarely asked about labor issues, but I'm always asked about nationalism issues. So, yeah.
In Ireland and in the United States?
Well,
Americans and Irish?
Well, this gives me an opportunity to say, now I can be an academic. One of the things I learned about being an academic, and Elizabeth will know, is I will say, and this is true, that's not my field. Right? And it's true. I would never attempt to interpret Irish current affairs. I mean, I've tried to interpret Irish history through an Irish American lens, but this is really going to get me off topic here. But since you mentioned it, I do find I resent it when people one of the things that I found about American journalism is that it has been transformed in part by imports from Britain and Australia, who have come here mostly paid for by Rupert Murdoch, but not all, and have come to interpret America and to us. And I don't understand how you can do that. I mean, I know a lot about Irish history, not as much as Elizabeth, but I know enough. I would never think to go to Dublin to be the editor of the Irish Times or the Irish Examiner in Cork, right? But we've seen in the United States, like the current editor of the New York Post spent his life in journalism in London. I'm sorry, excuse me, what does he know about New York? I have no idea how you got me on that topic, but obviously it bothers me. And by the way, it's not an immigration thing.
Yeah.
It's you know, the New York Post, and I used to work for the New York Post. The New York Post was, and the Daily News were both sort of working people tabloids of New York. And now it's indistinguishable from the Daily Mail or one of those Fleet Street rags that have brought the British IQ down by 50 points over the last 50 years. There, I said it.
Anyone on Zoom have a question or Facebook? I thought it was interesting, Terry, you mentioned your.
We can't hear the question, sir.
I haven't finished just yet. So I'll repeat it in a second. We don't talk about that kind of discourse, particularly this
Right. Well, one of the things that I learned as a later in life academic, I got my PhD in 2012, and I was born in 1955. So you do that math. But one of the things I learned later in life is that from academics who are probably more progressive than I am, and with whom I had many disagreements. But one of the things that they taught me was if you're only going to write about people who wrote letters, you are only going to write about a certain class of people. And that is absolutely true. But you know, what we still haven't quite figured out is, okay, then what next? And how far does interpretation go into fiction or guesses? And I suppose if you couch it that way, I mean, I certainly did. I wrote a dual biography of Franklin Roosevelt and Al Smith. And you see on a few occasions in that book, I do, you know, one of the characters is this guy, Charlie Murphy, who was the head of Tammany Hall. He was called Silent Charlie because not only did he not write letters, he didn't even speak. So how do I interpret the actions of a son of the famine? His father was a famine immigrant. And he goes on to preside over or to allow Tammany Hall in the 19 teens up in the state legislature to do things like pass unemployment compensation and beginnings of minimum wage. Why was he allowing that? Well, one interpretation is it was popular. I argue without any evidence whatsoever that he had this thing in his bones, this memory that even he could not, well, he didn't articulate anything. So, but I'm not saying it's a fact. I'm saying this is what I think. And I think historians can go there and should go there in telling the lives of people like us and others.
But they both came from poverty, the Great Depression. And I had the opportunity when I was in high school and college to work in a factory. My father worked on brakes and stuff so that I can get some money for college. And he'd always say to me, he goes, if the foreman comes around and wants you to work overtime, take it. And I remember as a kid, because we did 1 week at the Jersey Shore. And I remember many years my father would drive us down, drop us off, and then go back and work, even though he was on vacation, because he'd make triple time. And fast forward to 1995, I moved to this area. USS Slater comes in. My father's a Navy veteran, dropped out of Jamaica Vocational High School in 1942 and joined the Navy. And I took him, I said, Dad, take you there and go on a tour. And he gets on there. There's a guy on there who's probably, he was a Korean War vet, so he's a little bit younger than my father. And he's starting to give the tour, and he gets to the galley, and he goes, all the sailors always complain about all this stuff. My father was standing, he goes, I loved it. I liked every piece of it. I started thinking about it over a period of time. And his mother died when he was 4 of pneumonia in 1930 in the Depression. He went to live with his paternal grandmother in Queens and Woodhaven Boulevard. They were moving from apartment to apartment ahead of the landlord because it was the Depression and they couldn't pay the rent. And he joined the Navy because it gave him an opportunity to actually earn money. Not the safest occupation to have in 1943, but out in the South Pacific. But he got 3 square meals a day, he got clothing, and he got paid. And those are the kinds of things that kept him inside of him. And my mother was one of 13, and she's the only one that graduated from high school. And her point was, she wasn't going to go work in a factory when she became 16 years of age. She was going to graduate from high school, and she was going to go work in the offices that ran the factory, which she did. And she went into payroll, and she was payroll clerk. And there, all her brothers and sisters all dropped out of high school, all went to work in factories. And some of them went into the war also as well. But they always brought with them that concept of keep trying to work harder. Don't ever you don't want to go backwards. And they wanted to do better, and they wanted all of us to do better as kids. And I think that's what you were talking about as far as the fire that goes with that. And it's just, to me, an interesting thing as I look back introspectively over the years about why the Irish were involved in the labor unions, why they did the work that they did, and why people wanted to get into unions and get union jobs, because they got a living wage, and they got protection, and they got benefits and things that they never had.
Well, I think you've really hit on something really important, which is security. And I think that also goes back to the famine and the Irish experience in Ireland. The one thing that they counted on was the land, and the land had let them down, right? So the Irish come to the United States. These are farmers, and they settle in cities, right? They're not going to they're not going to be hungry again. But this Irish American obsession with security, and I don't say that in a disdainful way, but I think that's why we see the Irish legacy of the Irish police officer and the Irish firefighter and the Irish civil service, right? My father, firefighter, really wanted me to follow in his footsteps, not realizing that I wasn't brave enough to run into buildings. But I remember him telling me when I was 18 and off to college, saying, look, you'll have a pension after 20 years, and you'll never get laid off. Now, of course, the irony was, those of you who know your New York City history from the 1970s know that firefighters and cops actually were laid off. And I probably would have been, but I would not have been a good firefighter. And there's lots of reasons why I wouldn't be a good cop either, because my wife could tell you those reasons, but I wouldn't. But this idea of not being subjected to the vicissitudes of capitalism, right? So many Irish people I know, even my age and even younger, you know, that appeal of always having a job and not having to worry about getting laid off is so important. It's so ingrained in us. I really believe that. And I think that's because of the famine. I think we as Irish America are starting to get out of that now, you know, but no, I know a lot of Irish people. I don't know many who went into business, right? But I know a lot who went to the civil service. And I still think that's a legacy of the 1840s. And, you know, hopefully someday we'll get over that. But by the same token, it is perfectly honorable work. And I know plenty of honorable police officers and firefighters.
Timothy Marr, just talking to
Talk so much here.
Timothy Marr also really did ask about that after 9/11.
Yeah.
You know, just different downstairs because he mentioned the problem that the Irish and Latino always were.
Right.
There was a very obvious kind of distinction to the point that they were communal, and so you know success was defined differently.
Right. Right.
So yeah, Paul says that you know the Irish kind of social justice movement to where that's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you know nobody else has any other questions or comments, I think we have a slight sound issue when it's not the speaker that's talking, but that might be because I can't you and so the sound is going that way. But thank you everyone. Two more Irish stuff we will be go back to